Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on The Last Word. My name is Sophia Wanuna. Tonight, we continue our focus on the war on corruption. And just earlier in January, we saw the new commissioners of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission sworn in. But now the concern becomes, will they face the same fate as those that have come before them, the former commissioners of the EACC, or those that were there during the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission or the Kenya Anti-Corruption Authority? And if not follow that same script, what must happen for there to be a difference and for there to be milestones made and progress in as far as fighting graft in Kenya is concerned? That's a topic of discussion this evening, so we'll be unpacking just the issues around that particular matter. And joining me in studio just to introduce my guest that you'll be joining us in just a little bit while is Harrison Kenyanjui, who is a lawyer, as well as Harun Dubi is a lawyer as well. You see them right there, so they're on standby and they will be helping us unpack, is it a change in law and as far as the powers given to the anti-graft body, or do we need to rethink it all and have a different strategy? And remember, you can be part of this conversation. Tweet me at Sophia Wanuna. The hashtag is The Last Word. But let's get started tonight, because this EACC definitely having a rather heavy entry, and we want to have a look at just some of what they're dealing with, some of the matters before them. And we'll begin with the Chicken Gate scandal. That is one we've seen headlines, and even today, just Gladys Boss-Sholei being one of the officials of the former, now defunct interim Independent Electoral Commission, appearing before the investigators at Integrity Center. So the scandal involving, of course, procurement of ballot papers for the 2010 referendum, as well as these two by-elections, and officials of the then IEACC believed to have pocketed 50 million shillings in form of bribes called a chicken. And this matter, of course, being revived because of the two prosecutions that we saw happen in the UK. And following that, of course, matters saying that it takes two to tangle, then we must also see prosecutions as well happen here at home. So EACC on this matter has so far grilled 16 officials, among them James Oswago, who is the former CEO of the IEBC. Ahmed Isaac Hassan is the current IEBC chairman. He's appeared before the committee, rather the commission. That was yesterday. Trevor Yombra was a man alleged and accused of being the in-between these officials in the UK of the Smith and Usman company, as well as the IEACC. Of course, Gladys Sholei as well was an official in the IEACC, appearing today, and later on in the show we will hear what she had to say moments after she was grilled by the EACC officials. Still on the Chicken Gate, so two officials from the UK, as I mentioned there, have since been prosecuted and jailed over that scam. Let's see what else we have here on our super wall. 791 million shillings moving on from the Chicken Gate. Another scandal that is before the EACC's, the NYS scam. And this is one that dominated news headlines for a while. So the then devolution CS, former devolution CS Anne Waiguru, Peter Mengiti, and former NYS Director General Nelson Githinji were adversely mentioned. And one of the interesting developments we've seen from that story, initially the EACC coming out to clear Anne Waiguru, but just yesterday appearing before a parliamentary committee. Now the EACC, with their new commissioners in office, coming out to say there was a mistake, reversing that particular clearance, and in fact issuing fresh summons for Waiguru. So those there the developments that have since unfolded. So the NYS scam, fresh probe on the NYS scandal launched after Josephine Kabura's affidavit last month. Remember, it had all appeared to be taking a calm or a low down, but it has all come back to our headlines. Now, those mentioned in the affidavit alongside the ones we've just talked about there, Mutahi Nguni, who's a political analyst, Lois Mbarire, who's Waiguru's sister, Joseph Mugwanja, Director of Banking Fraud Unit, Aidan Harake, Senior Official at the National Youth Service, Hassan Noor, Secretary of Administration at the Ministry of Devolution and Planning. And of course, more details of that particular scam under the EACC's mandate now in terms of investigation. Then you'll remember the list of shame. Last year in March, the president, during the State of the Nation address, releasing that 175 list of people accused of being involved in graft. And some of those individuals are in his, or were in his cabinet, I beg your pardon, including Charity Ngilu, Michael Kamau, Lands and Transport there, as you've seen, Kazungu Kambi, Davis Churchill, and Felix Kosgei. Of course, these have since been replaced in the cabinet. But for Charity Ngilu and Engineer Kamau, initially when these proceedings were started, they moved to court challenging the mandate and rather the constitutionality of the EACC to be able to probe this matter. And just yesterday, the High Court in that ruling saying that in fact, the EACC erred in taking direction from the executive, as they did in that particular matter, and also that the EACC was not properly constituted because at that particular time they did not have commissioners. Remember, commissioners vacated office in May of last year. So they said for the EACC to be able to properly conduct their core mandate, which is to recommend prosecution, there needed to be commissioners who were not in office. Of course, another finding of the court was that those 60 days that the president directed these investigations be conducted by was also unconstitutional. So that just is the rundown of some of the matters. Of course, there are those other cases that are still before the EACC. Now, we just want to take a listen to what the former Chief Registrar of the Judiciary had to say earlier today, but of course appearing before the EACC in her capacity formally as an official of the now defunct Interim Independent Electoral Commission on that Chicken Gate scandal. And we'll continue with the conversation here in studio. Let's hear what she had to say.
EACC has been caught up in the public gallery. Just because they got a 60-day ultimatum by the president, they want to please the president and show the president that they are working. So they were parading people in court for the purpose of showing that they are in fact fighting corruption when they are not. They haven't even begun to scratch the surface.
All right, Gladys Boss-Sholay there earlier at the Integrity Center, having given her submissions and evidence, if you like, before the investigators at the EACC. And in studio, as I told you earlier, joining me tonight on The Last Word, next to me is Harun Dubi, and on my extreme right is Harrison Kenyanjui, who are both lawyers. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight. We'll be getting to the new commissioners and also the other issues around that. But let's talk briefly just around what you've been able to hear from the scandals that are now under investigation and consideration in the EACC. What do the current and recent developments say to you, Harun?
Perhaps before I talk about what the current scandals talk about, may I say something about the general anti-corruption effort? Corruption is a global phenomenon, a global problem. The strategy or tactic of having anti-corruption commissions or anti-corruption authorities becomes, to me, a global tactic. Actually, I thought it would be a strategy, but with hindsight, I think it's just a global tactic that we have copy-pasted to Kenya, but we have not followed on the value system for fighting corruption. So that we have an institution and we have a legal framework which is not supported by the necessary will, what you might call the political will, to deal with corruption. And we haven't yet removed the incentives for corruption in terms of the what people get to desire or enables them to engage in corruption and evade punishment or sanction.
Yeah.
So so that when you look at our newspapers lately, or watching the media, whether it's TV, newspaper, or radio, every day it is depressing news, because you read about half a newspaper, it's about corruption stories. And we as Kenyans, from the president, the chief justice, to every ordinary Kenyan in the media, a lawyer or whoever, they say, Kenya, there is a lot of corruption in the country. But when you ask individuals who ought to know, to put their finger on the pulse, they don't do it.
All right. All right, I want to bring in Kenyan because you mentioned something. Yes, the media has been awash with these headlines about corruption. So from where you sit, is it that we're losing the war on corruption, or is it that it is actually very vibrant, alive and active, we're doing well, and that's why there are all these headlines? Or is it that there's an increase in corruption, some have even argued?
In my view, actually, there has never been a war against corruption.
Yeah.
Never been. This is just a sham. We're just pretending to fight corruption because it pays. And even some of those commissioners have issues that they need to deal with in-house. Unless we do that, it's just going to be another depressing story after story. You find someone who's accused, actually, of receiving about 180 million of the Youth Enterprise Fund, and he's there before the Parliamentary Investment Committee, and he says that actually the person who received this money, allegedly in the United States, is dead. And instead of being arrested, he's actually being seen off. I mean, this is theft. Let's stop using these acronyms and names, euphemisms, corruption. These are thieves of public resources. Until we see them in that light, we will still have this game that we play of the EACC. Go ahead. We have enough laws. And like my last friend says, oh, well, we do not have the political will. Now you tell me, which farmer is going to employ a guard out there to guard the pen where the sheep are, and every night a sheep disappears. Every night a cow disappears. And the following morning the farmer comes and says, where's my sheep? Where's my cow? So I'm saying that those in the political leadership do not have the will to do it. Why? Because it's patronage.
When the president perhaps argues that haven't I dismissed 5 cabinet secretaries who have been
Dismissed?
implicated in graft, well, they're no longer in office, they're new
That's
ones.
that's just it, but they should be in jail. If someone actually has diverted resources that are meant for a road, in fact, we should be having bypasses that are having actually the proper flyovers for pedestrians to pass. And we are lamenting every time, oh, you know, the death from our pedestrian is so high, actually it's the highest in the world, and blah, 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 on and goes this way. And what happened? There is some public officer in charge of that portfolio who, instead of having that footbridge, diverted the money. They should be in jail. They should be in jail.
I want to say this, that our political system and our political values benefit heavily from corruption. Politics is fed by corruption. Our political leaders, through corrupt means, and we see it all the time, they bribe voters. Where do they get that money from?
No one asks.
That money comes from somewhere, and when they use that money to get into office, they have to recover that money, because if it was personal money they used, they must recover it.
Right.
So that they have themselves an incentive in gaining through that corrupt process, or corruption itself. But the other thing is the moralization of corruption by calling it an evil thing, therefore saying it is something almost an antithesis of religion, rather than seeing it as a crime, like my friend is saying, that those are people who belong to jail. But we say, oh, indeed you see the parking attendants in Nairobi City County with their yellow shirts printed, corruption is evil, instead of saying corruption is a crime for which people should be punished. When the president says, I have dismissed so-and-so from office, dismissal is a very small point regarding the sanctions those fellows should face. Upon dismissal, we need to see a successful prosecution. Now, and that brings me to the point of the institutional framework.
Right.
There are two things. There is the institutional framework, but there is also the legal framework. The legal framework, which is established by politicians who themselves are beneficiaries of corruption, is deliberately made weak. If you look at the Leadership and Integrity Act, if you look at the Public Office Ethics Act, if you look at our Chapter 6 and all the legal infrastructure that leads to all that, you find that there are internal weaknesses, legal weaknesses, that are deliberately insulated enjoined in the legal system, so that nobody as an individual can ever be held to account.
All right.
The second point about the weaknesses is the institutional infrastructure. You have, unfortunately, and this is the point I was making earlier when I talked about taking a global tactic and calling it a strategy, by saying we have one unit called an Anti-Corruption and Ethics Commission, which, because of the centralization of the war against corruption on that commission, we have actually centralized corruption because, A, the institution itself is allowed to become corrupt, and I believe this, the EACC